By the end of this video, you should be able to implement something like this. You hover on an avatar, you see some of the details of the user. You could also hover on the username, and you could also see some of their details as well as be able to follow them. Right? Then we are going to go ahead and reuse the logic you have implemented to actually support cards. These are not on Instagram, but we'll actually make a reusable directive as well as a reusable component that gives us this ability. And the other thing you notice is that the component will be able to know where it should be placed. In this case, the card is at the extreme end, so it should be placed on this section. If the card is at the bottom, it should be placed at this part. If the card is on this extreme end, it should be placed on this section. And then if it's here, it should be placed at this section. So we will see how to actually create those zones and make sure that our card is actually implemented at the appropriate section. All right. In this vertical list, the cards, they are only aligned vertically. That means we need to take care of elements that are at the bottom part and also the ones that are at the top. For example, at the top, the card will be placed at the bottom of its anchor, okay? And at the bottom, the card will be placed at the top of its anchor. The same applies to the avatars and the same applies to the avatars at the top also. Okay, so let's get started. For us to be able to achieve the implementation that we have here, we will work with two main things, an Angular directive and an Angular dynamic component. So let's begin by understanding what an Angular directive is. When it comes to Angular, we have three main types of directives. They are the components, the ones that we are used to. There's also the attribute directives. These ones, they actually change the look and feel of HTML elements. And finally, there are the structural directives. Structural directives, the key thing they do is DOM manipulation, adding or removing elements from the DOM. And if we look at our demo here, we expect that we'll be adding this one as well as removing it when we don't need it on the UI. So that means we are going to be working with a structural directive in our case. And as we have just said, a directive is just a class that is actually able to be added to a HTML element. Only thing is we get to decorate it with a name. We give it a name, then this name we actually get to add it to the element that we want the directive to affect in the way that we have said, whether structurally or in terms of the attribute. All right, so let's create the preview directive and see how we are going to add it to our HTML elements that we are going to work with. We now know that a directive is a class that has a directive decorator, and this is how it simply looks like. At the bare minimum, this is a directive. It has a decorator, yeah, it has a selector that you get to use on the HTML element, and it also has the standalone true, whether it's a standalone directive, if you're familiar with standalone components. Then it also has lifecycle hooks. You can do lifecycle events on directives as well. All right. So in this case, that means that in our engine init, that is where our logic should be starting. But before that, remember, directives are just components. And like components, they can also be able to receive inputs, yeah? So what type of inputs are we going to be passing in to our directive? As per the requirements that we have, we see that we have 3 required inputs and 1 optional input. The required inputs are the user data. This is the information that we displayed for this user when we hover on their card. Then we have the outlet anchor element, whereby this one is what will actually have or rather contain the dynamic component inside it. And then we have the parent anchor, which is a list of all the cards in their whole container. All right. Then we have snap to element ref. This one is an optional one because it's not necessarily going to apply to all cards. And if we look at the UI, we see that these cards, they will not need a snap to, but these ones, they will need a snap to because we need to place the card, the dynamic component either at the top or at the bottom. But for these ones, we set it at a dynamic position based on its location on the UI. Okay, so let's continue from there. If we look at our UI, we have 2 types of cards. We have the medium cards and we have the small cards. Now, if we go back and look at our code, we see that we have our medium card and our small user card. Something to explain just here that's important maybe, we have a base user card that actually accepts the inputs of the user data, and that means that whoever extends the base user card will actually receive these inputs as well. Okay, all right, now when we go back to our medium user card, we see that we are actually importing two things. The first thing is a preview directive that we need to actually use, and the other thing is a preview component that we also need to use. Because they are both standalone, we are going to import them here that they may be usable in this medium user card, and we do just the same in our small user card. So the next thing we actually take a look at is these parameters that we get to pass in. This is the medium user card, and we see we only pass in the three required parameters. The first thing is the user data, the other thing is the anchor, the other thing is the parent anchor. So in the small user card, we see that we get to actually pass in four things. The first one is the user data, the other one outer anchor element and the parent anchor, and finally snap to element ref. So the other thing you see is how we actually name. Yeah, the name that we put in our components element, that they can be able to now recognize and see, wait, I need to be extending the functionality of a preview directive. And with that, let's look at the changes that we actually have in our preview directive. Okay, here the changes that we have is this part here. So the first and important thing to note is this. What is this? This is actually a reference to, for example, in this case, the element that has extended the directives functionality. All right. And then, as we said, ng-on-init can also be called on a directive. We simply call ng-on-init so that we can now start listening for hover actions on the host element. And the host element in this case, in this part, for example, is this div, and in the part of the medium is this div as well. And if we now go ahead and take a look at our console, we will see something happening. So if we hover on a card, we should see the events. Like when we hover, it will show. When we stop hovering, it will detach. The same apply to our card and things like that, you see. And there is that latency that we have actually added here. So what did we change? All right. The changes that we made, the first one was actually just adding this part and setting it as a latency of 500 milliseconds. And then that will mean that we don't want to simply like make quick shifts. The way Instagram has a smooth transition is the same thing. And then when like the mouse leaves the host, and in this case, let's just actually log the host and we see what element will be referencing to. So if we log the host and then we reload the browser, we should see each and every element that has the preview directive attached to it being logged out. As you can see, we can see the avatar, we can see the username, and also we can see the cards as well. Because now we see that we can respond to the events of hovering, let's continue and add more functionality to our preview component. So if we take a look at our preview component, we are going to replace first of all the console log with this piece of code that is going to attach the preview when we hover on it after the given timeout. And then when we mouse leave, we are going to detach our component, and by detaching we mean that you are going to remove it from the UI. So if we look at the first function that we have added for attaching a preview, we see that it accepts a payload, and the payload it's accepting is of type iPreview position, where our preview will be placed. That means before placing the preview, we need to actually calculate the placement position of our preview component. And if we go ahead and take a look at our function for calculating the preview placement, don't be overwhelmed by all this data, yeah? Just think of it this way. The logic in here can change to meet your needs, but for our case, we need to return a preview position. And the most important thing, and that's the thing we are going to talk about next, is the zones placement. As we said, we can place it either on the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. So if we take a look at our zones, they should be looking something like this, whereby zone A is the top left, zone B is the top right, zone C is the bottom left, and zone D is the bottom right. Okay, so depending on the position of the card on the list, for example, in our list of items or on the horizontal axis, we should place it either on one of these zones. However, if the div, for example, or in this case, if the card appears in a zone that is not a list of horizontal elements. You remember the vertical list that we have, one similar to Instagram. In that case, we apply the snapping feature. The snapping element that we are going to be passing in is what will tell us whether we need to snap. And in this case, we only pass it in the small user card. We don't pass it in the medium user card. Let's just take a look at this quickly to see what we have added on the UI and how it actually behaves right now. Starting with the medium cards, if we hover on a medium card, the preview component should be placed on the appropriate zone. This one should be placed on zone A, this one should be placed on zone B, this one should be placed on zone D, and this zone C. And the ones that are in between, they can be placed in a convenient position on the UI based on where they actually are. So let's take a look at the code and see how this actually decides on the zone to place. This is the whole part. So the first thing we are going to say, let's take a look at what the parent anchor element is, and that is what we are using, we are getting by using this piece of code. We start by getting the position, the DOM rect of the parent element. Then with the DOM rect, we can actually calculate the center. So we decide if something is on this position of the parent center, it will appear in this zone. So I encourage you to go just take a look at this piece of code so that you can get to understand how placement works for the medium cards. Okay, now for the small cards, if we take a look at the bottommost card in this list, it should place it at the top. But if you take a look at the topmost one, it should be placing it at a position convenient. And if you take a look at the second card, it should be placed at the bottom. And then so forth, until we get to a card that is on the bottom half of the parent list. So if we take a look at the code for small user card placement, we see that we have snap to being the default for the host center, and then the host center Y will actually depend. If something is in either zone C or zone D, we have to increase it by the placement height so that it doesn't obscure the username, all right, or the avatar. So if we take a look at this, for example, in this case now, it will be placed here at the bottom where it's the height actually, and then if it's at the bottom, it will be placed at the top. Okay, so the same applies to the avatars. All right, so let's continue and see actually how do we inject this component that we are seeing, because right now we see it but we haven't talked about how the injection happens. Okay, you remember this part of code? Yeah, that's the part that we need so that we can actually inject our component dynamically. So what does it mean to inject a component dynamically? Dynamic components, they are actually created on the fly and appended to the appropriate anchors. All right, so if we check the attached preview, we see one thing. We are actually using the anchor element. If we take a look at our small user card, we see that the anchor, okay, it's an ng template that is within, all right, where we want this effect to take place. And this way, anything that will be added, in this case, the component that is going to be added on the UI, the preview component, will be added to this parent. This will be its parent. That's why we have the anchor inside the parent of the preview directive, and this will make it easy for us to detect the mouse over events. Okay, then once the component instance is created, in this case, we can pass in the user data and the position we received is a placement. All right, and then we call detect changes so that any lifecycle change events can happen. So for example, if we comment this piece of code out, nothing should actually happen. No components will be injected, even if the event is being detected. But then we come back, we comment it back in, then actually it should now be able to display the component that we have. And the same also applies to this one. All right, now it's time to take a look at the dismiss event. If we do this, we actually see dismissing when we hover out, and it's dismissing instantaneously. There is no latency. Let's go back to our code and we see what we have here for mouse leave event. All right, on the host Yeah, and remember the host, in this case, it is our cards. Now, when we open our detached preview, we should see just something so simple. First of all, we are clearing the timeout. And then if we don't clear the timeout, with latency, like if someone can do it so fast, we will have two elements. Like if we do this and this, you see? So if we do something really quick, we will have two elements dynamically injected on the UI, something like that. But we don't want that. It feels so buggy. That is why we are actually clearing it out. Then we get to remove whatever was actually there in the anchor element. All right. So in this case, we remove anything. For example, for the username, we will remove whatever is inside the ng outlet. And for the case of maybe like the avatar, the same. We remove whatever was there in this reference. And then for the case of the medium user card, we actually remove what was there in the anchor. So that's just it. And that wraps up our preview directive. All right. So we can actually remove that and we save this. Now let's move over to our preview component and see what is it that makes it work. Actually, even mostly the positioning. All right. So let's continue with our preview component. First thing that we note about our preview component is that the host that we have here, we are setting the position to a fixed position. All right. And then we are giving it as the index of 10 so that it appears on top of everything. Then if we take a look at the HTML itself, we see that the wrapper that we have here, we're also giving it a position of fixed, okay? Then the most important part is this variable here. Think of it as a template variable that it references a HTML template in the component. In this case, what we need to do is we need to position the wrapper in a position it has received, and the position that we received are the iPreview position. If we take a look at the iPreview position definition, we will see it has a few things. It has a zone, it has a host center, it has a host center X and host center Y. So we go back and we see that the outlet is what we are going to be styling, all right? And the other thing we need is simply the render utility. The render utility, if you're familiar with utility functions, and if you have not checked one of the tutorials that we had for creating reusability, please go and check it out. So what it will simply do, it will receive a HTML element, a style, and the value for that style, and then it applies them. This way, we get to actually use Angular's renderer 2 for styling, and it's always recommended. All right, let's go back to our code. So in the ng after view init, that is when we start our placement. And as you can see, the code is not that large. It's so small. Yeah, it's concise. So let's understand what it does. First of all, we pick the zone. We decide which zone is it. Is it zone A, B, C, or D? All right, based on the image for zones that we had. So we say if it's zone A, this is where it will be placed. And then you notice the things that we are passing into this common function. It's either left or top. And then we pass the two, and then they are applied at the same time. So it can be top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. All right. So that's it. And then once we run this piece of code, that is why we are now seeing the behavior that is expected. And you note, this only applies the top left and all the zones. They will only apply on these cards that are actually medium, that are in a list that is horizontal. All right, but for these ones, it's either the top or at the bottom, okay, based on the snapped information that we passed in. So if we take a look at our preview component HTML section, all we need to do, or all we need to understand here, is that like a user, some of the users, they have posts, one post, and so forth. So let's just look at this briefly, how we have created this. And if we take a look at it, we will see like we are using ng templates. ng templates are really powerful when it comes to reusability in the UI. For example, in this case, we have account metric template. We don't need to duplicate like divs and so forth. We just create one template. In this case, account metric, we pass in the parameters, and the account metric, I mean this part here, like this is a metric post, and the value and the label, the value and the label. And that is what we have here, the value and the label. Then we have our formatter pipe. And again, all these things, we can't capture them in this tutorial, but I believe you can take a look at the code. And if you have any questions, always reach out. Okay. So a quick recap of what we have accomplished today. We start at the app component. We pass in the appropriate cards based on their position on the UI. Then the cards will be extending the base card, and then each and every card will have its own declarations of the anchor elements. Then each card will actually be appending the preview directive to the place that it feels it wants it to appear. Then the same applies for the small card as well, and then the directive itself. This is actually the driving part of this whole tutorial. Once more, I encourage you, play around with the code, try and change things so that you can actually understand it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And then finally, we get to inject the component. And as you can see, component, this is more of a component that is a presentation component. It only accepts inputs and it displays them whenever it's supposed to display. And then the preview component itself, it has one important part, and this is the reference that we are now using here so that you can be able to position it at the appropriate place on the UI based on the zones that we talked about. And finally, we see that the position of this preview component, it has to be a fixed position so that it can be anywhere on the UI, and based on the zone that it received, and the zones that we have are these ones. And with that, until the next one.